The snow was falling heavily that Christmas Eve, blanketing the small town in a cold, eerie silence. The streets were deserted, as families stayed indoors, basking in the warmth of their fireplaces and the festive glow of Christmas lights. But for Claire, it was just another lonely evening. She had recently moved to the outskirts of town after her divorce, seeking solace in the quiet of the countryside. Her new home was a small, rustic cabin nestled at the edge of a dense forest. It was charming in daylight, but took on a haunting air when night fell. That night, the darkness outside seemed impenetrable, the only light coming from the flickering Christmas tree in her living room. Claire sat on her couch sipping hot cocoa, the crackling fire the only sound breaking the stillness. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She sighed, missing the company of her family. Her ex-husband had taken the kids this year, leaving her to spend Christmas alone for the first time in years. As she stared into the fire, lost in thought, a sudden, loud knock at the door made her jump. The sound echoed through the cabin, shattering the tranquil silence. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could possibly be out in this weather, at this hour? Slowly, Claire got up, her bare feet hesitant against the cold wooden floor. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. At first, she saw nothing but swirling snow. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, his face partially obscured by a hood. He stood perfectly still, staring at the door. "Who's there?" Claire called out, her voice trembling slightly. The man didn't answer. Instead, he knocked again, this time more insistently. Claire hesitated. Every instinct told her not to open the door. She glanced at her phone on the table, debating whether to call the police. But what would she say? A stranger knocking on her door wasn't exactly a crime. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to sound braver than she felt. "I'm lost," the man finally replied, his voice muffled by the door. "My car broke down. Can I come in and use your phone?" Claire's heart raced. She didn't like the idea of letting a stranger in, especially not on a night like this. But what if he was genuinely in trouble? The storm was brutal, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. "I'll call someone for you," she said, her voice firm. "Just wait there." She turned to grab her phone, but when she looked back through the peephole, the man was gone. The porch was empty, the snow undisturbed. A chill ran down her spine. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the back of the cabin. Claire spun around, her breath catching in her throat. It sounded like something, or someone, was trying to get in through the back door. She grabbed a fireplace poker and crept toward the kitchen, her hands trembling. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The thudding stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear any sound over the howling wind. Then, the knocking returned, this time on the front door. Claire's blood ran cold. She tiptoed back to the living room, clutching the poker like a lifeline. Peering through the peephole again, she saw the man standing there, his hood still obscuring his face. But something was different now. His posture was wrong, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "I just need to come in for a minute," he said, his voice eerily calm. "It's freezing out here." Claire's instincts screamed at her to keep the door locked. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. She needed to call the police, but her phone was in the living room, and she couldn't risk turning her back on the door. The knocking grew louder, more aggressive. Then, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire's grip on the poker tightened as she crept toward the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of where the man had gone. As she peered through the curtain, her heart nearly stopped. The man was standing just outside the window, his face pressed against the glass. His hood had fallen back, revealing hollow eyes and a twisted grin that didn't seem human. Claire stumbled backward, a scream catching in her throat. The lights flickered, and then the cabin was plunged into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the snow outside. Claire's breathing was ragged as she fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. 911. "What's your emergency?" the operator answered. "There's someone outside my house," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "He's trying to get in. Stay on the line," the operator instructed. "Officers are on their way." But before Claire could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone in disbelief, the screen now showing no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell tower. A sudden crash came from the back of the house. Claire spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the kitchen. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were inside now. Claire backed into a corner, clutching the poker like a weapon. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. She held her breath, praying the intruder wouldn't find her. The figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint glow of the snow outside. It was the man, but something about him was grotesquely wrong. His limbs were too long, his movements jerky and unnatural. He tilted his head as if studying her, and then let out a guttural laugh that echoed through the cabin. Claire screamed, swinging the poker with all her strength. The man, or creature, dodged it easily, his grin widening. She stumbled toward the door, desperation fueling her movements. She managed to fling it open and ran out into the storm, the icy wind cutting through her like a knife. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road, her bare feet numb from the snow. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and she waved frantically, collapsing in relief as the car pulled over. The driver, an older man, helped her into the vehicle, his expression one of concern. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked. "There's someone in my house," Claire gasped. "Please call the police." The man nodded, pulling out his phone. But when Claire turned to look back at her cabin, her blood ran cold. The windows were dark, the door shut tight. There was no sign of the man, or the creature. When the police arrived, they found no evidence of a break-in, no footprints in the snow, no signs of forced entry. It was as if nothing had happened. But Claire knew what she had seen, and she knew she could never spend another Christmas Eve alone in that cabin again. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the quiet suburban street in a serene stillness. Inside the Parker home, the warmth of the fireplace cast a cozy glow, and the Christmas tree stood tall, adorned with twinkling lights and ornaments collected over decades. For Anna Parker, this Christmas Eve was bittersweet. It was the first holiday she and her 9-year-old daughter Lily would spend without her husband James, who had passed away unexpectedly the previous spring. To make the evening special for Lily, Anna went all out, cookies baking in the oven, Christmas music softly playing, and the twinkling tree creating a magical ambiance. Yet beneath the festive cheer, an uneasy stillness lingered in the air, as if the house itself mourned the absence of James. "Mommy, can we put this one on the tree?" Lily asked, holding up a small, ornate box she had found in a dusty corner of the attic. Anna's brow furrowed. "What's that, sweetie?" she asked, kneeling down. Lily opened the box to reveal a delicate, antique Christmas ornament. It was a hand-painted glass bauble, depicting a snowy village under a deep blue sky. It was beautiful, but Anna didn't recognize it. "That's strange," Anna murmured. "I don't remember seeing this before." "Can we hang it?" Lily asked, her wide eyes filled with excitement. Anna hesitated, a chill creeping down her spine as she examined the ornament. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but something about it felt off. She couldn't explain it. Shaking off the feeling, she smiled at Lily. "Of course. Let's put it in a special spot." Lily carefully hung the ornament on a low branch of the tree, admiring how it caught the light. "It's perfect," she exclaimed. As the evening wore on, Anna tried to enjoy their Christmas Eve traditions, but she couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was wrong. She found herself glancing at the ornament repeatedly, its intricate details seeming to shift slightly each time she looked at it. The snowy village almost seemed alive, as if tiny figures moved within its painted surface. By the time Lily went to bed, Anna was on edge. The house felt colder than usual, despite the roaring fire. She decided to call it a night, turning off the lights and heading upstairs to her bedroom. Anna was jolted awake sometime after midnight by a faint sound, soft, rhythmic tapping. She sat up, her heart pounding in the darkness. The noise was coming from downstairs near the living room. "Lily!" she called out, but there was no response. Grabbing her phone for light, Anna crept down the stairs. The tapping grew louder with each step. It was coming from the Christmas tree. She froze when she saw the ornament, its once idyllic village now shrouded in an eerie, swirling fog. Tiny, shadowy figures moved frantically within the painted scene, as though they were trying to escape. The tapping stopped abruptly. Anna stared at the ornament, her breath catching in her throat. Was she losing her mind? She reached out to touch it, but before her fingers could make contact, the lights on the tree flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A cold draft swept through the house, carrying with it a faint whisper. Anna turned sharply, her phone casting a weak beam of light across the room. The whisper grew louder, a chorus of overlapping voices, too faint to understand, but unmistakably desperate. "Lily!" Anna shouted, her voice breaking. She raced upstairs to her daughter's room, only to find the bed empty. The window was wide open, snow drifting onto the floor. Panic surged through her as she leaned out the window, calling for her daughter into the snowy night. "Mommy?" Lily's voice came from behind her. Anna whirled around to see Lily standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Anna asked, pulling her into a tight hug. "There's someone in the house," Lily whispered. Anna's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Where did you see them?" "In the living room," Lily said. "They were by the tree. I thought it was Daddy at first, but—" Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in Anna's shoulder. Anna's heart raced as she grabbed a heavy flashlight from the nightstand. "Stay close to me," she told Lily. Together they crept back downstairs. The living room was empty, but the air was thick with an oppressive, icy stillness. The ornament now glowed faintly, its foggy interior illuminated by a dim, unnatural light. Anna's grip tightened on the flashlight as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Get out of my house!" Anna shouted, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The tree began to shake violently, ornaments crashing to the floor. The antique bauble remained untouched, its glow intensifying. Anna shielded Lily as the growl grew louder, reverberating through the room. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the chaos stopped. The room was silent. The ornament lay on the floor, its once beautiful surface now cracked and blackened. Anna picked it up gingerly, feeling a strange warmth emanating from it. Inside, the painted village was gone, replaced by swirling darkness. "We have to get rid of it," Anna said, her voice firm. She grabbed a metal box from the kitchen and placed the ornament inside, sealing it tightly. She and Lily braved the snowstorm, driving to the edge of the nearby woods. There, Anna dug a hole in the frozen ground and buried the box deep beneath the snow. As they drove back home, the weight on Anna's chest began to lift. The house felt warmer, safer, when they returned. She tucked Lily back into bed, whispering reassurances as she kissed her forehead. But as Anna lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't entirely alone. The whispers were gone, but the memory of that growl lingered. Sleep came fitfully, and when morning arrived, Anna was relieved to see the sun shining brightly over the snow-covered landscape. Downstairs, the Christmas tree stood bare, its decorations scattered on the floor. Anna cleaned up, determined to make the day as normal as possible for Lily. They opened presents, played in the snow, and spent the day trying to forget the horrors of the night before. But as Anna carried the last of the wrapping paper to the trash bin outside, she froze. Sitting on the porch railing, gleaming in the winter sunlight, was the ornament. Its surface was pristine, the snowy village inside restored to its former beauty. Anna's breath caught in her throat as the faintest whisper reached her ears. "Merry Christmas, Anna." It was a crisp Christmas Eve night in the small town of Maple Ridge. Snow blanketed the streets, muffling the sounds of the world. Twinkling lights adorned every house, casting a festive glow against the frost-covered windows. For Sarah Mitchell, the holiday spirit was muted this year. She had recently moved into her late grandmother's old home after inheriting it, and the place, though quaint, always felt unnervingly quiet. Sarah was alone, sipping a glass of wine by the fireplace, her favorite Christmas movie playing in the background. The house was tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed darker than usual under the cloud-covered moon. She had tried to decorate the home with a tree, garlands, and candles, but the solitude of her first Christmas without family weighed heavily. Just as Sarah started to feel the warmth of the fire seep into her bones, a faint tapping broke the silence. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from the window beside the front door. Tap, tap, tap. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't the gentle knock of a neighbor or carolers. Those were cheerful and polite. This tapping was sinister, almost taunting. She stood up, her glass trembling slightly in her hand. She approached the window cautiously, her breath fogging up the glass as she peered out into the dark. The porch light barely illuminated the area, but she could make out footprints in the snow leading up to her door. Large, heavy prints that didn't belong to her. There was no one outside. Sarah's rational mind kicked in. Maybe it was kids playing a prank or a delivery driver dropping off a package. She tried to brush it off and returned to the couch, turning up the volume on the TV to drown out her nerves. But then came the knock. Bang, bang, bang. It was louder, more insistent this time. Sarah's stomach knotted as she stood up again, her movements slower now. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table, unlocking it with shaky fingers. She debated calling the police, but what would she say? Someone knocked on her door? Hello? She called out, her voice steady but uneasy. No answer. Sarah's grip on her phone tightened as she approached the door. She peered through the peephole and saw nothing, just the empty porch and swirling snow. Her breathing was shallow as she double-checked the locks, ensuring the deadbolt was secure. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Sarah stepped away from the door, every creak of the old wooden floorboards echoing in her ears. She glanced at the windows, their frosty panes now feeling like fragile barriers between her and whoever, or whatever, was outside. Suddenly the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the fireplace. Sarah gasped, her hands fumbling for the flashlight app on her phone. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows as if nature itself had joined forces with the night's menace. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text message. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Why don't you let me in, Sarah?" Her blood ran cold. She dropped the phone, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls as it hit the floor. Someone knew her name. "Who's there?" she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. No response. She picked up the phone and dialed 911, her fingers trembling so much she almost dropped it again. The operator's calm voice came through, asking for her emergency. "There's someone outside my house," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "They're knocking, and they just texted me. They know my name." "Stay calm, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Stay on the line with me." Sarah nodded, even though the operator couldn't see her. She crept toward the kitchen, searching for something, anything she could use to defend herself. Her hand landed on a heavy cast-iron skillet. It wasn't much, but it was something. The knocking resumed, this time from the back door. It was louder, more violent, as if someone was trying to break it down. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she backed into the living room, clutching the skillet. Then she heard it, the sound of boots crunching on snow. She turned toward the window and screamed. A figure stood just outside, their face obscured by the shadows of a hood. They didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring into the house. "Officers are almost there, ma'am," the operator said, her voice distant against the roaring fear in Sarah's ears. The figure finally moved, but not away from the house. They pressed their hand against the glass, leaving a foggy imprint. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She ran to the front door, unlocked it, and bolted outside into the freezing night. The cold air hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop running. Her bare feet sank into the snow as she sprinted toward her car. She fumbled with her keys, her breath coming in frantic gasps. As she unlocked the car and slid inside, she locked the doors and started the engine. Looking back at the house, she saw the figure standing on the porch, illuminated by her car's headlights. They turned their heads slowly toward her, as if to acknowledge her escape. Then, with deliberate slowness, they raised a gloved hand and waved. Sarah's heart threatened to burst as she sped down the road. She didn't stop until she saw the flashing lights of a police cruiser. She pulled over, jumping out of the car to meet the officers. "They're at my house," she yelled. "Please, you have to hurry." The officers didn't waste a second. They sped toward her home while Sarah followed behind, her stomach churning with dread. When they arrived, the house was empty. The snow on the porch was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. The back door was locked, the windows intact. There were no footprints in the snow. Sarah tried to explain what had happened, but the officers exchanged doubtful looks. They assured her they would patrol the area and left her alone once more. She sat in her car, staring at the dark house. Her phone buzzed again. A new text. "See you next Christmas, Sarah." She screamed and threw the phone onto the passenger seat. She knew she couldn't go back inside. The house wasn't just quiet now. It felt alive, watching her, waiting for her to return. She started the car and drove, determined to spend Christmas Eve anywhere but there. As the snow fell heavier, her headlights barely piercing the darkness, Sarah's mind raced. Who was the stalker? Why had they chosen her? And more terrifyingly, how did they know her name? She never found the answers, but one thing was certain. She would never spend another Christmas Eve alone in that house again. The Brooks family was well known in the small town of Cedar Hollow for their elaborate Christmas displays. Each year, their home turned into a winter wonderland with thousands of twinkling lights, a life-sized Santa sleigh on the lawn, and a perfectly decorated tree glowing through the front window. This year was no different, except for the unease that seemed to linger in the air. It was Christmas Eve, and as the snow gently fell, neighbors gathered to admire the Brooks' dazzling lights and wish each other a happy holiday. The laughter of children echoed in the cold night, but something about the Brooks house seemed off. The lights were as bright as ever, the decorations immaculate, but no one had seen the family all day. "They're probably just busy getting ready for Christmas," one neighbor suggested, but another shook their head. The Brooks are always outside, handing out cocoa and chatting with everyone on Christmas Eve. It's not like them to stay inside. By midnight, the street was quiet again. Most families had gone to bed, excited for the morning to come. But across the street, Mrs. Peterson couldn't sleep. Something about the Brooks house gnawed at her. The lights were still on, the Christmas music playing faintly through the night, but there wasn't a single sign of life inside. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her. She bundled up in her coat and boots and stepped into the snow. As she approached the Brooks house, the music grew louder. She knocked softly on the door, but there was no answer. She tried again, this time harder, her knocks echoing into the silent night. "Mr. Brooks? Mrs. Brooks?" she called, her voice shaky. When no one responded, she tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around her, and the smell of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air. The Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, and stockings hung neatly over the fireplace. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. "Hello?" she called again, her voice trembling. Her eyes scanned the living room. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture or missing decorations. It looked as though the family had simply vanished in the middle of their holiday preparations. The unease in her chest deepened as she noticed something strange. 4 steaming mugs of cocoa sat on the coffee table, untouched. Her heart raced as she moved further into the house. The kitchen was spotless, the table set for Christmas breakfast. A small pile of wrapped presents sat on the counter, each labeled with a family member's name. The unease gave way to fear as Mrs. Peterson noticed something else. There were no coats hanging by the door, no boots on the mat. It was as if the Brooks had walked out into the freezing snow without any protection. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise upstairs. It was rhythmic, almost like whispering. Her body froze, every instinct screaming for her to leave. But her legs moved forward as though compelled by an unseen force. She climbed the staircase slowly, her footsteps barely making a sound against the carpeted steps. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't English. No, it wasn't a language she recognized at all. It sounded guttural and ancient, like the words of something inhuman. She stopped in front of the master bedroom, the source of the sound. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob, but before she could touch it, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. Gathering her courage, she pushed the door open. The room was empty, the bed neatly made. The only sign of life was a small, wrapped gift sitting on the nightstand. Mrs. Peterson's hands trembled as she picked it up. The tag read, "To the Brooks family, forever together." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She dropped the box and backed out of the room, her breath coming in panicked gasps. As she turned to leave, she heard a faint laugh behind her. A child's laugh. She spun around, her eyes darting around the empty hallway. That was enough. She bolted down the stairs, her heart pounding as she ran for the door. But as she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked, the deadbolt turning before her eyes. "Let me out!" she screamed, banging on the door. But no one heard her cries. The lights in the house began to flicker, the Christmas trees glow, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. A sudden gust of icy wind blew through the house, extinguishing the lights and plunging the room into darkness. Mrs. Peterson turned, her eyes adjusting to the faint glow of the snow outside. Standing by the tree were 4 shadowy figures, 2 adults and 2 children. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow. The tallest figure stepped forward, extending a hand toward her. "Stay," it whispered, its voice hollow and echoing. "Join us." Mrs. Peterson screamed, stumbling backward. The shadows closed in, their icy presence suffocating. She collapsed onto the floor, her vision blurring as the whispering voices filled her ears, wrapping around her like a cold, suffocating blanket. The next morning, Cedar Hollow woke to a pristine Christmas day. The snow sparkled under the sunlight, and the neighborhood was alive with the sounds of children laughing and families celebrating. But the Brooks house was eerily quiet. Mrs. Peterson's son, concerned that she hadn't answered his calls, walked over to check on her. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Just like the Brooks, Mrs. Peterson had vanished without a trace. Inside, the house looked as though nothing had happened. The tree was still lit, the stockings still hung, and the steaming mugs of cocoa on the coffee table were now joined by a 5th. And on the nightstand in the master bedroom sat the small, wrapped gift, its tag rewritten, "To the Petersons, forever together." It was a Christmas Eve like no other. Snow blanketed the town of hollow pines, muffling every sound, leaving only the faint rustle of the icy wind. I was spending the night alone in my parents' old house. They had retired to Florida earlier that year, leaving me to look after the property during the holidays. The house was large and drafty, and though decorated with twinkling lights and garlands, it always felt eerily quiet when no one else was around. I was sitting by the fireplace in the living room, sipping hot chocolate and scrolling through my phone. The Christmas tree sparkled brightly in the corner, its reflection shimmering in the large bay window across the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, creating a scene so still it felt frozen in time. It was almost midnight when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow had moved across the window, quick and fleeting. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring at the glass. Nothing. Just the snow drifting lazily under the glow of the streetlight. I shook my head, blaming my overactive imagination. Spending Christmas Eve alone had made me jumpy. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept into my chest. I pulled the curtains closed, trying to block out the unsettling thoughts, and turned up the volume on the TV. But then it happened again. This time, I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow outside. My body stiffened, and I strained to listen, the sound of my heartbeat almost drowning everything out. Someone was out there. Grabbing my phone, I moved cautiously toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The yard was empty, the snow undisturbed. The streetlight cast long shadows from the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. "Maybe it's just a stray animal," I whispered to myself, trying to calm the growing panic. As I let the curtain fall back into place, the motion-activated porch light flickered on. My breath caught in my throat. Someone, was standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the light's reach. It was a tall, dark figure, its outline barely visible against the snowy backdrop. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My stomach twisted into knots. I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911, but my fingers were trembling so much that I almost dropped it. 911, what's your emergency?" the operator answered. "There's someone outside my house," I whispered, my voice shaking. "They're just standing there watching me." "Are all your doors and windows locked?" the operator asked calmly. "Yes," I replied, glancing nervously at the back door. "Please send someone quickly." "Stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. My eyes stayed glued to the window, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I let out a shaky breath, but the relief was short-lived. A loud thud came from the back of the house. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I moved toward the kitchen, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The thud came again, louder this time, like something or someone was pounding on the back door. I stopped in my tracks, my hand gripping the phone like a lifeline. "They're at the back door now," I whispered into the receiver. "Stay where you are," the operator instructed. "Help is almost there." The pounding stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I held my breath, listening for any sound. Then I heard it. A faint scratching, like fingernails against glass. The porch light flickered and went out, plunging the yard into darkness. The only light now came from the faint glow of the Christmas tree in the living room. My mind raced as I backed away, keeping my eyes on the kitchen window. Suddenly a voice came from outside, low and distorted. "Let me in." I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would burst. The voice was inhuman, hollow and echoing, as if it didn't belong to this world. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. There was no reply, just a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down my spine. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though it was trying to claw its way inside. I ran to the living room, grabbing the fireplace poker for protection. The sound stopped. For a moment, the house was silent again, and I dared to hope that whoever, or whatever it was, had gone. But then, I saw it. A face pressed against the bay window, pale and twisted, its eyes black and soulless. It grinned at me, its teeth sharp and glistening. I screamed, stumbling backward. The face disappeared, but the pounding on the front door began, shaking the entire house. The tree's ornaments rattled and the lights flickered wildly. "Help is outside," the operator said suddenly. "Officers are there." I bolted to the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I peered outside. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance. Relief washed over me as I saw two officers step out of their cruiser, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But my relief was short-lived. As the officers approached the house, the shadow reappeared, this time behind them. It moved unnaturally fast, its long limbs bending at impossible angles. I banged on the window trying to warn them, but it was too late. The shadow enveloped the officers, their screams piercing the night. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. The house fell silent once more, the flashing lights of the cruiser the only sign that anyone had ever been there. I stayed huddled in the corner until morning, too afraid to move. When the sun finally rose, I ventured outside. The cruiser was gone. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that the officers, or the shadow, had ever been there. But as I looked back at the house, my blood turned to ice. Written in frost on the bay window were the words, "Next Christmas."